Good evening. Thanks for joining us this hour. Happy Wednesday. We begin tonight with some breaking news, with some late-breaking political news about the United States Senate and what has just happened to the national Republican hopes for winning control of the United States Senate in the November elections. What just happened tonight was very unexpected news. Okay, the context here is that Republicans need a net gain of 6 seats in order to win control of the U.S. Senate and move Mitch McConnell up the ladder from minority leader to majority leader. Republicans' control of the House is really, honestly, not in jeopardy in these elections, barring some act of God. And Republicans, of course, cannot dislodge President Obama from the White House in this election, but they really can try to win the Senate. And that really is the big enchilada at stake this year. And, of course, it would have huge consequences, not just for the country, but specifically in political terms for the rest of the Obama presidency. So Republicans have been focused on the Senate singularly. And they have a lot of potential ways to gain the 6 seats they would need in order to take over the Senate. Republicans do appear, at least the odds look like they will, Republicans do appear to be on their way to flipping Senate seats from blue to red, from Democratic to Republican, in the 3 states that are marked on this map right here, West Virginia, South Dakota, and Montana. And nothing's set in stone, but that's the way the odds look right now. Depending on how those races play out, Republicans would then need to win only 3 of these other 7 states marked on the map right now that are all considered toss-up races in the Senate: Alaska, Arkansas, Colorado, Iowa, Louisiana, Michigan, and North Carolina. So that's not the only scenario for Republicans taking control of the Senate, but it is among the most obvious. And so because they've got that kind of a wide pathway in which they could take over, Republicans have been really optimistic about their prospects of getting the Senate this year. On paper, it looks good. But that optimism, that confidence, what they see as their rosy odds for getting control of the Senate, those odds all depend on Republicans, of course, not just winning seats they don't already have and winning the toss-up races. They obviously depend, as a baseline, on Republicans keeping hold of the seats they already have, especially seats they believe to be safe because they're in bright red states where they don't expect to ever find themselves in competitive races. And that is what has just happened in this surprise move tonight, and what has just happened broadly to Republicans in this next national election. 3-term Republican incumbent Senator Pat Roberts has been leading in the Kansas Senate race. He's running for re-election, right? But for a veteran senator, Kansas's Pat Roberts has not been doing all that well. All through the primary season, he had to fight off these allegations that he doesn't really live in Kansas anymore, that he has become a citizen of Washington, D.C. instead. And in fact, it turns out that Pat Roberts does not own a home in Kansas anymore. He instead rents a room from campaign supporters and uses their house as his voting address. Not a good look in an anti-incumbent environment when you've been in Washington for more than 30 years. Right. So that was a very damaging revelation against Kansas Senator Pat Roberts in the primary, okay, in the Republican primary where he's trying to hold on to his seat. Now, fortunately for Pat Roberts in that primary, his opponent was kind of a freak show. His opponent, his claim to fame was that he was a distant cousin of Barack Obama, which is funny and, you know, gets you booked on Newsmax or whatever. But his profession is that he was a doctor. And it turned out, not very far into the campaign, February of this year, that the Topeka Capital Journal reported that as a doctor, Milton Wolfe, this primary opponent to Pat Roberts, had made a habit of posting X-rays of gunshot victims and other victims of violence on his Facebook page, along with comments usually mocking the victims. When the Topeka Capital Journal confronted him about those images, showed them to him, and asked him to explain himself, he said, yeah, they serve to show that evil lurked in the world.
What about this? Do you think there was permission given about this?
Now, look, if you don't identify a person, then you don't need their permission.
We need to understand what the thinking is. We don't know, I don't know exactly how to handle material like this. I'm asking you professionally, is this material professional?
This is the kind of material you see in medical education textbooks.
This is Facebook.
This is Facebook. Having that guy for an opponent in the Republican primary was a real gift. to Pat Roberts, who against a, theoretically competent Tea Party style opponent might have had a really bad time. Luckily, he had that guy instead. He did get banged up statewide over the question of his residency. That's the kind of charge that tends to stick with Kansas voters. And honestly, Pat Roberts has not really been popular in Kansas. It should be noted that even with the X-ray freak show guy as his opponent, Pat Roberts still only beat that guy in the primary 48 to 41 points. He did beat him, though, and now in the general election, Senator Roberts has had the double blessing of running in a three-way race in the general election. He's been polling in this PPP poll at 32%. He's the incumbent, right? 32%, that's not good. That's almost a synonym for vulnerable. But luckily for him, it is a three-way race, right? And because the Democrat and the independent in the race really split the remainder of the vote quite evenly, Pat Roberts, by virtue of that, was still in this thing. He was still looking like he was a winner because that Democrat and independent running against him were really screwing up anybody else's chances. That was the lay of the land until today, until late today, until a few minutes before close of business today, which was the deadline for this thing to happen. After today, because of what just happened, this is not a three-way race anymore because the Democrat has now announced that he is dropping out of the race to give somebody else a better chance of unseating Pat Roberts. Chad Taylor was the Democrat in this race. About 45 minutes before the close of business in Kansas today, on the day of the deadline, he asked the Kansas Secretary of State to take his name off the ballot. He is done. He had initially said that he was suspending his campaign. He then crossed it out by hand and wrote, his campaign is terminated. The Democrats have decided to try to win this race against Pat Roberts by quitting this race against Pat Roberts. The statement was kind of amazing. I should tell you about that crossout. The AP posted a picture of it so you can see the actual physical change there. Chad Taylor saying, quote, after much consideration with my supporters, my staff, and party leadership at every level, I've decided to end my campaign for the U.S. Senate. I have great love for the state of Kansas and for the people that live here. I will continue to work in their best interest every day. But effective today, my campaign is terminated. You can see that the statement first said suspended, but then it got changed to terminated. Kansas Democrat Chad Taylor tonight has terminated his campaign for the Senate, thus giving Democrats the biggest leap forward they have had this entire year toward holding control of the United States Senate for the last 2 years of the Barack Obama presidency. I mean, what this leaves is a two-way race in Kansas between Senator Pat Roberts, who has not been polling all that great and who had a very damaging primary campaign against the freak show X-ray guy, against the guy on the right side of your screen here. His name is Greg Orman. And in polling and a head-to-head matchup against Pat Roberts, he looks comparatively fantastic. I mean, look at the polling. Check this out. Here we have Pat Roberts eking his way to victory with the Democrat still in the race. But with the Democrat gone, the race just between Republican Pat Roberts and independent Greg Orman, Pat Roberts loses that race by 10 points. You can bet that Pat Roberts is not happy about this news today. The Pat Roberts campaign tonight released a blistering statement about this decision. The headline says, Taylor's withdrawal, corrupt bargain with Democrats. Orman, choice of liberals. Today's bombshell news out of Kansas marks the second time this week, and it's been a short week, marks the second time this week that we have seen Democrats decide that the best way to win a race against the Republicans was to quit and try to get there a different way. I mean, in Alaska yesterday, we were able to report that the Democratic candidate for governor of Alaska had announced that he would instead run for lieutenant governor in essentially a fusion candidate. The independent candidate for governor has a better chance of defeating the Republican incumbent, so the Democratic candidate jumped out of the race to become his running mate instead. They formed an unusual but not unprecedented fusion ticket. Democrats made that decision in Alaska this week because the polling shows it's their best chance in Alaska to unseat the Republican governor there, Sean Parnell. The exact same way that the polling shows right now that having the Democratic candidate drop out of the Senate race in Kansas is Democrats' best hope, not just inside Kansas of unseating Pat Roberts, but in this overall national fight for control of the United States Senate. We talked on this show last week about the polling by Sam Wong. He works out of the Princeton Election Consortium. In the 2012 elections, just so you understand who we're talking about here, Sam Wong correctly predicted all 33 U.S. Senate races. He got 0 states wrong in terms of predicting the outcome for Senate races in 2012. And Sam Wong has been tracking this race in Kansas as people have been talking about what seemed like this pie-in-the-sky chance that the Democrat would drop out and clear the way for an independent who was very likely to beat Pat Roberts. I mean, with the Democrats still in the Kansas race, Sam Wong put the Democrats' overall chances of keeping control of the Senate for the whole country at 55%. The Democrats plus the independents who already caucused with them have a 55% chance of remaining in charge, according to this prediction. But with what just happened tonight, with the Democrat dropping out in Kansas, according to Sam Wong's calculations, the odds of the Democrats holding on to the Senate nationwide for the whole country, those odds move to 85%. 85% chance of a Democrat/independent majority in the United States Senate. The Republicans are going to be so mad about this when they finally take a minute to understand what just happened here. As Sam Wong wrote last week, the Democrat dropping out in this race could be a, quote, total game changer, a game changer on a national level. And now that is exactly what has happened. The Senate race in Kansas doesn't have a Democrat in it anymore. The Republican who had been limping to a probable victory is suddenly in a very competitive race. As an independent candidate, Greg Orman has clearly been a strong candidate. Before the news broke today, he'd already got the endorsement of a group of moderate Kansas Republicans. A lot of the same Kansas Republicans who had endorsed the Democratic challenger for governor over the deeply unpopular Republican governor there, Sam Brownback. Greg Orman got that endorsement today from all those Kansas Republican leaders, even though he's still not told anybody whether he would align himself with Republicans or Democrats in the event that he actually won this Senate race. Our own Steve Kornacki here at MSNBC, though, got a chance to ask Orman about it just last month.
Even if you're an independent, if you were elected, you could have the deciding vote after this fall's election. Which side would you vote for?
Well, you know, I think that's a great point, Steve. And ultimately, if I get elected, there's a reasonable chance that neither party will have a majority in Washington. And if that's the case, what I've said is I'm going to caucus with whichever party is willing to actually go to Washington and start trying to solve problems as opposed to just pleasing the extremists in their own base.
Of course, it was Steve Kornacki who got that interview. Prescient as always, Steve Kornacki having last month done that interview with a man on whom the prospects for control of the United States Senate now turn. And Greg Orman, as you heard him there, sounding like a legit moderate in that interview. He really did just become one of the biggest wild cards in the whole 2014 elections. Game on for the control of the United States Senate in a way that it was not before a few hours ago. Game on as of tonight.